Good evening and welcome. What a wonderful thing it is to see Armstrong Browning Library's foyer of meditation full of people who are eager for the kind of life of the mind that we'll see on display tonight. My name is Douglas Henry. It's my honor to serve as Dean of the Honors College at Baylor University. This is a regular installment in what for us has become a much heralded and anticipated annual lecture series in ethics and culture. Our guest tonight, you will know if you are here, is Joseph Loconte, best-selling author, educator, and filmmaker. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana, Wheaton College, and King's College, London. Among other roles, I'm especially taken with his work as director of the Rivendell Center in New York City, an academic center dedicated to exploring and advancing the legacy of classical Christian thought and culture, inspired, as those of you who are in the know will know, and if you're not in the know, you should be in the know, inspired by Tolkien's vision of Rivendell, the kingdom of the elves in Lord of the Rings. The Rivendell Center aims to be a haven of creativity and beauty and wisdom and friendship by hosting dinners, salons, lectures, film screenings, and study that introduce the best which has been thought and said in the world to college students and young professionals in New York and indeed around the world. Its signature storytelling initiative is its YouTube history channel, History and the Human Story. Mr. Loconte's commentary on religion and public life appears in the nation's leading journals and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Affairs, the New Criterion, and National Geographic. For 10 years, he served as a commentator for NPR's All Things Considered. Loconte has served as a testimonial. He has given testimony. He has testified before Congress, there you go, on international human rights, and served as a human rights expert on the 2005 Congressional Task Force on the United Nations. Advised the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives as well. The author of numerous books, including the latest of which forms the backdrop for tonight's talk, War, Friendship, and Imagination, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the Fight for Civilization. Joe, we're grateful to have you here on Baylor's campus. We're grateful for your presence, for your wisdom, for your insight. We look forward to what you will share with us. Join me, colleagues, in welcoming Dr. Joe Loconte.
Well, welcome everybody. Can you hear me back there in the bleacher seats? It's all good? Yeah? Good? What an incredible welcome I've gotten on this campus. First time to this campus, first time to Waco here. And you know, you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not a local boy. And so the hospitality is pretty amazing, right? And I know we got rival events going on the campus right now as well. So thank you all for making time for this event. And I can tell there's a lot of excitement in the air. I want to manage the expectations by telling a quick little personal Italian story. So stop the clock just for a second. I was in Naples, Italy, just passing through Naples, and I lost my passport. Now, it's Naples, so it was probably stolen, you know, it's Naples. And I realized that I'm in the midst of a campaign, a mayoral campaign. And the Italians can be as cynical about their politics as we Americans can be about their politics. And there was a candidate, he was a joke candidate, a farcical candidate for you older guys in the crowd. He looked like a kind of a young Groucho Marx. And his face is plastered all over the city of Naples. And he had a one-line slogan. Here's his slogan. Non farò niente, ma lo farò molto bene. I will do nothing, but I will do it very well. So that's my goal tonight, guys. That's my goal. And I should say the story here of Lewis and Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, you know, their lives were bracketed by two global conflicts. We have no one alive today to tell us what that was like. But a little personal family history quickly. My Italian on both sides, my paternal grandfather, Michael Loconte, was living in the United States doing what Italian immigrants do, sending money back home. The war breaks out, and the Italians want him to fight in the Italian army. The Americans say, fight for us, and if you survive, we'll put you on a fast track to citizenship. I think he thought about that for 10 seconds. He says, I'm fighting for the Americans. He winds up in France in 1918 at the Meuse-Argonne, survives, settles in Brooklyn. That's Grandpa Loconte. Grandpa Aiello, the Aiello side of the family, he leaves Italy in 1921, a year before Mussolini comes to power. Nice timing, Grandpa Aiello opens up a barbershop in Manhattan close to Penn Station, settles in Brooklyn, and here we are. How about a round of applause for the grandparents? Right? Amazing. All right, let's get into it. Halfway through the First World War, November 30th, 1916, a group of European leaders attend the funeral of Franz Joseph, ruler over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In a ceremony scripted by the emperor, himself, before his death, he lays out the whole ceremony before his death. The grand cortege carrying the coffin halts outside of the Capuchin monastery in Vienna, where all the Habsburg emperors were laid to rest. And what transpired was a whisper from an earlier time, a nod to the transcendence of God and the frailty of men. The herald on behalf of the emperor knocks on the monastery door. "Who is knocking?" shouts the abbot inside. "I am Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary." "I don't know you." Again the herald shouts, "I am Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Bohemia, Galicia, Dalmatia, Grand Duke of Transylvania, Duke of..." "We still don't know who you are," interrupts the abbot. And at this moment, the herald falls on his knees and in front of all the assembled declares, "I am Franz Joseph, a poor sinner, humbly begging God's mercy." "Enter then," the abbot says, and the gates open. So the funeral of the Austro-Hungarian emperor, it symbolizes an outlook already in an advanced stage of decay. The First World War is credited with ushering in the modern world, friend, and with it the belief that concepts like beauty, virtue, heroism, and truth were dead. Assumptions about the moral life, about the existence of good and evil, seem to have vanished into the killing fields of the 1914-1918 war. By the end of that war, the emotional and spiritual lives of millions of ordinary Europeans were caught up in what you might call a no man's land of doubt and disillusionment. And of course, the war unleashes a storm of murderous ideologies: fascism, Nazism, communism, totalitarianism, and the terrible result is a Second World War, the most devastating war in human history. Well, two of the most influential writers of the 20th century, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, were caught up in the fire and the fury of these conflicts. Both men had fought as British soldiers in the trenches in France during the First World War. Barely 20 years later now, they must endure a second global conflict. We cannot begin to understand their astonishing achievements as authors until we enter into their world, friends, their world, a world in crisis. And the moment we do this, we begin to see how the long shadows cast by the Second World War invaded their minds and their imaginations. We begin to see that much of what they wrote and taught was a deliberate rebuke, yes, a rebuke, to the ideologies that were assaulting the dignity of the human person, the substitute religions of modernism, Freudianism, scientism, socialism, fascism. I can put my thesis in 3 words: war, friendship, and imagination, because it's the tragedy of war that brings these two amazing authors together in friendship, and it's their friendship that makes possible the creation of their great epic works. Joining with other like-minded authors and friends, the Inklings, they stage what I'm calling a rebellion, a literary revolt against the spirit of the age. War, friendship, and imagination. All right, let's unpack it. 1933, February 9th, we're in the Oxford Union, where a debate is being held, a motion is put forward for a vote. This House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. Let me say that again. This House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. What do we make of that? The motion is approved by a vote of 275 to 153. Never in the long history of Great Britain had a generation of future leaders, friends, leaders, among the best educated in the Western world, publicly renounced any obligation to defend their nation in wartime, and their timing couldn't have been worse. It could be argued that 1933 is the year in which the liberal democratic project of the West begins to unravel. It's the year when Woodrow Wilson's dream of a new world order based on the brotherhood of man starts to dissolve, when naked aggression goes unchallenged, when mass murder is committed with impunity. When Franklin Roosevelt arrives in office, the presidency in 1933, the United States is in the throes of the Great Depression. FDR promises to solve the nation's economic woes, proclaiming, quote, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Well, there are other things to fear. Militarism in Asia. Japan, under the leadership of the supposedly divine Emperor Hirohito, is waging a brutal war of aggression against China. In the communist Soviet Union, there is mass starvation and political violence. Joseph Stalin's policy of collectivization, which basically means the government takes your private property, right? That word is appearing again, friends, collectivization, being used by the mayor of New York right now. Let's see how that turns out. It's created a famine, though, in the Soviet Union, collectivization, a famine of biblical proportions. By the spring of 1933, at least 5 million people are dead, millions more on the brink of starvation. In Ukraine, think about this with the war between Russia and Ukraine. In Ukraine, the famine is killing 25,000 people a day. A day. Well, what else is happening? In Italy, there is Benito Mussolini. The fascist dictator swept into power in 1922, determined to restore Italian greatness on the world stage. By 1933, Mussolini is secretly drawing up plans to invade Ethiopia, making it a colonial possession. And then, of course, there's Nazi Germany. January 30th, 1933, barely 10 days before the Oxford Union Society vote, Adolf Hitler is elevated to chancellor, making him the second most important person in the country. 2 days later, he dissolves the parliament. So the German government is now led by a man who had announced his intention to tear up the Versailles Treaty, rebuild the military, and pursue a policy of territorial expansion. Well, why do I say all that? Because it's at this moment, friends, in 1933, the start of an unprecedented assault on the moral norms of Western civilization that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis engage their literary talents to try to hold the line. Hold the line. And in this endeavor, they draw from deep wells the collective wisdom of the literary canon of the West. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Milton, the stuff you guys are reading right here, right, at Baylor. That's what they're doing. Well, we don't know exactly when Tolkien started writing The Hobbit. Got any hobbits out there in the audience? Little hands, come on. Time to come out of the closet now, hobbits, come on. All right. We don't know exactly when he started writing it, but he completes the first draft in 1933, The Hobbit. Now, The Hobbit has been described as a book about entering manhood. But maybe in the end it's about much more than that, because the hero in the story, Bilbo Baggins, he leaves the safety of the hobbit hole and confronts genuine evil. He puts his own life at risk to help his friends, resisting the powerful temptation to slip away to safety and return to his hobbit hole. Now think about it. The First World War produced a generation of writers disenchanted with the concepts of courage and sacrifice. Think of works such as A Farewell to Arms, Goodbye to All That, All Quiet on the Western Front. Many authors have become consumed by the idea of lost innocence. Lost innocence. The Hobbit is the beginning of Tolkien's reply. They shall not have the last word. Well, C.S. Lewis is engaged in his own literary counterattack. 1933, he publishes a spiritual autobiography in which he exposes the ideologies that were all the rage during his year as an atheist. The book is modeled on Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. But Lewis calls his book The Pilgrim's Regress. Why? Because his pilgrim has to unlearn many of the assumptions of his age. Does any of that sound familiar? Unlearn the stuff that's being thrown at you. Lewis takes on Freud, Marx, Mussolini. He skewers the modernist movement in literature and the arts, which had embedded itself in leading cultural institutions. Modernism, guys, is like in 2 sentences. It rejects the idea that there is a moral and spiritual purpose to our lives. Think the absurd, think the nonsensical, think the irrational, think T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. No, that's not Loconte's backyard garden. That's the wasteland, right? Lewis mocks this literary and artistic set whom he calls the clevers. The clevers, because they're just so clever, these young people, cynical. Explains a very young clever in the story. We lost our ideals when there was a war in this country. They were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. Our ideals were ground out of us in the mud and the flood and the blood. No line better describes the modernist mood. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis deeply resent this outlook, and they conspire to do something about it. Probably at the end of 1936, they make a literary pact between them. Lewis had a nickname for Tolkien. He called him Tollers, T-O-L-L-E-R-S. He has this little conversation, 1936. He says, Tollers, there's too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves. It's agreed. Tolkien will write a story on time travel. Lewis will write a story about space travel. But both of their stories must point to the great story, God's rescue mission for mankind. Now, think about it. These are Oxford dons. They're academic eggheads, right? They're not political figures. What do they hope to accomplish? Now, whatever their objectives, we can't forget that Tolkien and Lewis are Englishmen, and they care deeply about their country and its civilization. They know there are threats all around. They resent the cynical outlook that's in vogue. They must have concluded that the literary establishment could not be counted on to pierce through the moral fog. And Britain's national life, its culture, its politics, desperately needs moral clarity, and the two friends decide to do something about it. So what do? Tolkien begins, but he never finishes his travel story. But in 1937, he publishes The Hobbit. And then almost immediately, he starts writing the sequel, The Lord of the Rings. And with this epic story, Tolkien will almost single-handedly retrieve the concept of the mythic hero and reinvent him for the modern mind. Meanwhile, C.S. Lewis fulfills his part of the bargain. In 1938, he publishes Out of the Silent Planet, the first book in the space trilogy. It's a story about a trio of Earthlings who travel to another planet, Malacandra, Mars, where they encounter 3 different species of rational creatures, all living in harmony. The story's protagonist is a guy named Elwyn Ransom. He's a Cambridge professor, a language guy, a philologist, clearly modeled on Tolkien, right? Ransom has to battle 2 other travelers, Dick Devine, who is a profiteer, and Dr. Weston. Weston, the mad scientist, hell-bent on colonizing other planets. Well, they meet on this planet. They meet the Oyarsa. The Oyarsa, the planet's ruling intelligence. And the Oyarsa asks Ransom why he and his companions have come to this planet. Hey, what are you doing here, right? One man is motivated by greed, Ransom says, the other by a darker force. And here's how Lewis puts it. I think he, Dr. Weston, would destroy all your people to make room for our people. Then he would do the same with other worlds again and again. He wants our race to last for always, I think, and hopes they will leap from world to world. Think about that line. Weston would destroy one race to make room for his own. Well, what does that sound like? What does that sound like? C.S. Lewis does not need to invent this apocalyptic nightmare through fiction. It's occurring on Britain's doorstep. In Hitler's Mein Kampf, the elimination of the Jews from Europe is essential for Germany's attainment of living space for the Aryan race. And by 1938, Hitler's assault on the Jewish people is the central fact of his domestic policy. First, you burn books, and then you burn people. Okay. Tolkien and Lewis, they imbue their stories with a deeply religious outlook, quality, the biblical doctrine of the fall. Now, C.S. Lewis is more explicit about this, but both authors convey the idea of a cosmic struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. So, it comes as something of a shock to Lewis that most of the reviewers of his first book, Out of the Silent Planet, these are educated guys, Times of London, educated people, they're reviewing the book. They fail to notice the religious concepts at the center of the story. This gets his attention. He writes about it to his friend, Sister Penelope. Here's what he writes to Sister Penelope. You will be both grieved and amused to learn that out of about 60 reviews, only 2 showed any knowledge that my idea of Weston, the bent one, was anything but a private invention of my own. But if only there was someone with a richer talent and more leisure, I believe this great ignorance might be a help to the evangelization of England. Any amount of theology, he says, can now be smuggled into people's minds under cover of romance without them knowing it. There's a breakthrough. He has a breakthrough. It's hard to convey the significance of his breakthrough. Lewis realizes the potential of great storytelling to recover the core teachings of the Bible. This is Anglican England in 1938, but it's deeply secular. Well, this realization occurs at the very moment when the political regimes rejecting the God of the Bible and embodying radical evil dominate the world stage, and Great Britain is at the storm front of the evil. Think about it. The survival of Great Britain is cast into doubt, friends, September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. The Polish people become the first of many victims of the Nazi blitzkrieg, the lightning war, right? 2 weeks after Britain's declaration of war, Tolkien writes to his publisher to explain why he doesn't expect to make much more progress on this new story about hobbits. Here's what he wrote his publisher. Any far-reaching work of my own is out of the question, for I'm liable to be summoned to a job undertaken last spring at any moment and have no idea what time, if any, outside of that I shall have. What job is he talking about? Codebreaker. Codebreaker. Codebreaker for the British Foreign Office at Bletchley Park. He got several days of training. They need language guys. But in the end, his skills are not going to be required. But friends, Oxford now faces the possibility of massive bombing raids, food shortages, and the likelihood of a land invasion. They're expecting the Nazis to invade. So the British government begins evacuating mothers and children from London and to other cities to the European countryside to escape the anticipated bombing campaign. Nearly 3 million people are evacuating during the first 4 days of this exodus. Think about those numbers. 12-year-old Lillian Hanson, an evacuee from London, captures the moment with these lines. A sadder day there was never before, when all mothers, rich and poor, stood and wept when their children went away on the great evacuation day. Well, 4 children, all girls, appear at Lewis's home at Oxford the day after the Nazi invasion of Poland. I'm a bachelor, he says to Sister Penelope, and never appreciated children till the war brought them to me. Patricia Heidelberger was one of those girls, and it's really fun reading some of their essays and reflections on that time. Here's what Patricia wrote, staying at the Lewis home. My first impression of C.S. Lewis was that of a shabbily clad, rather portly gentleman whom I took to be the gardener and told him so. He roared, he boomed with laughter. Lewis will stir an intellectual awakening in the young people who come into his home. He will help them. Think about this. He will help them with their homework. He will help them with their papers. Now, over to you guys. Who would you rather have you help you with your paper, C.S. Lewis or AI? Can I get some answer on that? Can I get an amen on that, C.S. Lewis, yeah? All right. Well, I think the presence, though, of these children transforms Lewis as well. From a confirmed bachelor who does not enjoy the company of children to the author of one of the most beloved series of children's books in modern fiction, The Chronicles of Narnia. Think about it. War is the spark that lights the flame of imagination. It's probably at this time in 1939, after children evacuees have become a regular fixture in the Lewis home, that he scribbles on a back page of a paper. He scribbles the opening lines of the first book in the series. Here are the opening lines, the original opening lines. This book is about 4 children. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of the air raids. They were sent to stay with a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the Pevensie children flee the terrors of a world at war, only to enter Narnia, friends, where another war is being waged between Aslan and the forces of the White Witch, where it's always winter and never Christmas. Welcome to New York City, kids. I'm a native New Yorker. I can pick on New York, all right? Well, Britain is not winning the war against Germany. Not winning. When 300,000 British, French, and Belgian troops are pinned down at Dunkirk, northern France, waiting to be annihilated by the German army, Winston Churchill is given an offer to negotiate. Negotiate with Hitler, make peace. By this time, in the summer of 1940, virtually all of Europe is in Nazi hands. The military situation is desperate. The peace plan with Hitler brings to mind a scene in The Lord of the Rings, Saruman's offer to Gandalf. Remember this? The offer to join forces with Sauron. Here's how Tolkien put it. A new power is rising, Saruman says. Against it, the old allies and policies will not avail us. Make a deal with Sauron. Well, Winston Churchill tells his cabinet that he considered carefully whether he should enter into negotiations with Hitler. And here's what he told them. I am convinced that every man of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. That is leadership. That's leadership. The Prime Minister's determination to resist Nazism at all costs, echoed in every major speech he delivered during the war. It has a transformative effect on the British people. But I believe it can also be discerned in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. Think about it. Remember the Battle of the Pelennor Fields? The armies of Mordor are massing to destroy the forces of Gondor and Rohan, but the leader of the armies of Rohan is unyielding. Here's how Tolkien describes it. Stern now is Eomer's mood. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come hither, for he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand and fight there on foot, till all fell, and do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor. You know, when Frodo and Sam journey into Mordor in their attempt to destroy the Ring of Power, they are exhausted, nearly overcome by the black skies, the painful fumes. As Frodo casts himself upon the ground, Sam resolves his internal debate about what he must do. Here's how Tolkien put it. He knew all the arguments of despair and would not listen to them. His will was set, and only death would break it. Friends, this is the spirit of the British people in the summer of 1940 as they prepare for the Battle of Britain. Think with me of those 18 and 19-year-old boys climbing into their Spitfires to take on the German Luftwaffe. How many 18 and 19-year-old boys do we have in this room, and girls? Anybody? Think of the residents of London throughout the Nazi Blitz. 76 consecutive nights of air raids, save one, on the city of London, bombing the city of London. 76 9/11 attacks on the city of London. And what do the Londoners, the city of Londoners, what do they do the next day? They go back to work. They go back to work. London can take it is their motto. Keep calm and carry on. They bought us time. That's what the British people did at this moment, because we're not in the war, right? We're on the sidelines. We're in an isolationist mood. They buy America time to find our resolve, time to shed ourselves of our selfish isolationism. But what if they'd made a deal with Hitler? What if the British people had made a deal? The British people, once considered lazy and decadent by their enemies, resisted to the end. They held on, as Gandalf once described the hobbits, soft as butter they can be, yet sometimes as tough as old tree roots. Now think about what they're up against. Everything Hitler has promised the German people has come true. Everything. After the defeat of France, the German people are ready to follow him anywhere. Hitler's speech to the Reichstag, July 19th, 1940, broadcast around the world, evokes the hatreds and the triumphalism of his Nazi movement. Guess who's listening to that speech? Guess who's listening? C.S. Lewis. Lewis is with his physician friend, Dr. Robert Hayward. I actually interviewed Dr. Hayward's daughter for part of this book project. She's in her 80s, living in Oxford. He's with Hayward. The speech airs over the BBC, simultaneously translated into English. They listen to it together, and it has an almost hypnotic effect. Lewis writes about it to his brother. I don't know if I'm weaker than other people, but while the speech lasts, it's impossible not to waver just a little. Think about that. This is C.S. Lewis. This is not a simpleton. While the speech lasts, it's impossible not to waver just a little. Let's just think about that, the power of propaganda. Well, here's the speech on a Friday. Sunday now he's in church, at Holy Trinity Church. And while listening to the sermon, Lewis starts thinking about the devil. I don't know how bad that sermon was, but man, oh man. He's thinking about the devil. And he gets the idea for a diabolical satire. He calls his book The Screwtape Letters, and it exposes the roots of the totalitarian temptation, sitting in church, right? Well, Britain is alone, friends. Britain is alone. And it looks like 1941 could be the year of collapse. And Tolkien suggests as much in a letter to his son, January 1941, his son Michael, serving as an anti-aircraft gunner now in the British military. Men, think about this. Fathers, think about this. You fought in the First World War, and now you have a son serving in the Second World War. So just think about the emotional anxiety and the dread that you must feel. Here's what Tolkien writes to his son. Plain reasoning seems to show that Hitler must attack this country direct and very heavily soon and before the summer. Writing again to Michael, March 1941, he admits that his son's fear that he might not survive the war is not unfounded. Here's what he wrote. None of us may survive, not even Priscilla, his youngest, his daughter. I often have a sudden, horrible fear that we shall all perish. Tolkien then goes on in the letter to recall the dread that engulfed him when he left as a soldier for the Western Front in 1916. Here's how he put it. I never expected to survive. And the intense emotion of regret, the vivid, almost raw perception of the young man who feels himself doomed to die before he has said his word is with me still. A cloud, a patch of sun, a star, or often more than I could bear. Friends, this is life in England in 1941, the destitute year, and things get worse. December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and a surprise attack on the United States, crippling the Navy, killing more than 3,200 soldiers and civilians. On the same day, Japan attacks the British outpost of Malaya, sinking the British battleship, the Prince of Wales, killing 840 soldiers, all gone, civilians and soldiers. Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day, with reports of the rape and massacre of many civilians. Japan is now at war with America and Great Britain. Germany declares war on the United States, forms a military alliance with Japan and Italy. It is now a global conflict. And in the midst of that, December of 1941, Tolkien's daughter Priscilla receives a letter from Father Christmas. Father Christmas. Tolkien began writing and illustrating his own Father Christmas letters to his children while they were still toddlers. The letters are usually filled with the escapades of the polar bear, the chief assistant to Father Christmas, whose comical adventures affect the annual Christmas stock. A lot of whimsy, but not in 1941. The Christmas letter of 1941, there are goblins, and the goblins are on a rampage. Here's what Father Christmas writes. I expect you remember that some years ago we had trouble with the goblins. We thought we had settled it. Well, it broke out again, worse than it's been for centuries. Father Christmas notes that fewer children have written to him in previous years. I expect it's because of this terrible war, he writes. So terribly many people have lost their homes or have left them. Half the world seems in the wrong place. Half the world seems in the wrong place. Merry Christmas, Priscilla. It's life, friends. He's not going to shield his children from the horrors of war. He won't shield them from it. Well, 1941, a director of the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, BBC, aware that many of its audience are struggling with the horrors of war, asked C.S. Lewis to offer a series of talks, radio talks, explaining and defending the Christian gospel. Let me say that again. I didn't make that up. The BBC asked Lewis to give a series of talks defending the gospel. How far they've fallen at the BBC. Lewis agrees. Travels by train from Oxford to London, which is not without risk. London's still being bombed. The BBC has been bombed. Here's the opening line of his first broadcast for the BBC. The first line. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Everyone has heard people quarreling. What do we do when we quarrel? We appeal to a moral standard, right? A standard of right and wrong that we're sure the other guy has violated, right? We appeal to that standard. Lewis calls this the clue to the meaning of the universe. And so for the next 15 minutes, from 7:45 to 8 p.m., this former atheist introduces the BBC audience to the concept of a universal moral law. That's where he starts his broadcast, friends. Parenthetically, yeah, he'll lead that audience to Jesus, but he can't start with Jesus. Not in 1941, not even in Anglican England. He has to start with, everyone has heard people quarreling. Well, the universal moral law. Think about it. The same concept is embedded in Tolkien's epic story. Remember the exchange between Aragorn and Eomer in The Lord of the Rings? They're coming to grips with the growing threat of Mordor. How is a man to judge what to do in such times? Eomer asks. As he has ever judged, says Aragorn. Good and evil have not changed since yesteryear, nor are they one thing among elves and another thing among men. It is a man's part to discern them. That's the moral law. Well, in a moment, think about it, at a moment in history when the moral foundations of Western civilization seem to be disintegrating, here are two authors trying to reverse the rot. Reverse the rot. One of Lewis's radio talks to the BBC is called The Invasion. The Invasion. The Christian faith, Lewis says, it teaches that the struggle between light and darkness is not a war between equal and independent powers. Here's how he puts it. It is a civil war. It's a rebellion, and we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. Enemy-occupied territory. That is what this world is. And he goes on. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed. You might say, landed in disguise. And he's calling all of us to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. So here's the question for us. are we conducting our Christian lives as if we really believed that we were living in enemy-occupied territory? Are we part of the resistance? Well, the BBC broadcast will be edited into a book, Mere Christianity, one of the most influential works of Christian apologetics ever written, and it's written, friends, in wartime, right? All right, December 1941. Tolkien has taken his story to the breaking of the fellowship, when Boromir, one of the company, tries to take the ring from Frodo by force. And the ring, as you know, gives you the ability to make yourself invisible. Whoever possesses the One Ring controls all the others. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, my precious. Been wanting to do that all night, I'll tell you. The Ring of Power, the Ring of Power. It's the motive force behind Sauron's attempt to enslave or destroy anything that stands in his way. This is how Tolkien describes him. He brooked no freedom, nor any rivalry, he says, and he named himself Lord of the Earth. What does that sound like? It sounds like a literary expression of a political ideology, totalitarianism. Totalitarianism. This is the geopolitical reality, friends, as Tolkien is composing his epic story. Remember, he's writing it right through the Second World War. This is the outlook that dominates the regimes in Tokyo, Berlin, Rome, Moscow, the will to power. Tolkien began writing The Lord of the Rings in 1937, nearly completes it before the Allied victory in 1945. Now, Tolkien always insisted that his story about the fight for Middle-earth, it was not an allegory of the Second World War. But Loconte wants to gently suggest that may not quite be true. I want to suggest this. The political realities of these years, the cult of the dictator, the utopian schemes to perfect humanity, the malevolent march of Nazism could not have been kept out of the author's mind. Not possible, I don't think. Think about this. Sauron, the Dark Lord, had acquired a fortress in the mountains from which to execute his evil designs. So, too, did the Führer acquire a fortress at the Kelstein in the German Alps, the Eagle's Nest. My story is about power, Tolkien explained, power exerted for domination. He's got a ringside seat to this, friends, in Great Britain. The contagion of war, the lust for power, the existence of radical evil, and the courage required to resist it. Think about it. The catastrophic events of the war brought all of these concepts into focus in The Lord of the Rings. Art is imitating life. Life is imitating art. All right, as we bring it to a close. Many of the young people who studied under Tolkien and Lewis during the war, the war years, they later recalled the sense of living through a singular moment in their lives. And it's just so fun as an historian to find these reflections from these students during the war. Here's what Rachel Trickett said, a student of C.S. Lewis. We made our way weekly through the blackouts to hear this extraordinary man. Pupils who survived the combat of his tutorials learned to love and rely on his humanity, his loyalty, his stealthy generosity. The bicycles would line up 5 rows deep to go hear Lewis speak. Helen Wheeler attended lectures by Tolkien, was a pupil of Lewis during the war. War news, of course, was unavoidable, often wrenching. Listen to Helen Wheeler. But at few times can there have been such splendidly exciting lectures and such overflowing lecture halls. And then she goes on. What it meant for my generation of English language and literature students was that what happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. Indeed, that they were the same. Think about what she's just said. What happened in the great books was of equal significance to what happened in life. Tolkien and Lewis inspired a generation, helped them to understand that the truths expressed in the great books, the old books, were deeply relevant to the events of the modern world, a world at war. From 1939 to 1945, it really seemed that the forces of barbarism would prevail. It really looked as if the survival of England depended upon the choices of quite small people who overcame their fears and fought the terror from the skies. In the shadow of this reality, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they formed the nucleus of a small group of like-minded authors and friends who met weekly to share and discuss their works in progress. They called themselves the Inklings, and together they created a beachhead of resistance. That's the phrase, I think, a beachhead of resistance. Kind of what you guys are doing right over here at Baylor, a beachhead of sanity, a defiant no to the forces of disintegration that were threatening the civilized world. Well, you know, it never would have happened if these two remarkable authors had not met and become friends. In his book, The Four Loves, Lewis wrote that every true friendship is a kind of secession, even rebellion against the forces of darkness. And the story of the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis, it's an account of how two men help one another to emerge from his own private darkness and to climb back into the daylight. Walter Hooper, who served as C.S. Lewis's private secretary the last year of his life. I interviewed Walter Hooper a few years ago. He was in his 80s. He's since passed. And he told me that Tolkien, because he got to know Tolkien as well, Tolkien was more interested in inventing new languages rather than writing a sequel to The Hobbit. He didn't want to do it. But C.S. Lewis helped change his mind. Now, here's what Tolkien said to Walter Hooper, who told it to me. You know, C.S. Lewis was such a boy, and he had to have a story. And that story, The Lord of the Rings, was written to keep him quiet. I don't know if that's true or not, but at the very least, Tolkien admitted, without Lewis's great encouragement and demands for more, give me more, Tollers, give me more, you can do better, he never would have finished The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien read out loud virtually every chapter of The Lord of the Rings to C.S. Lewis, often bringing him to tears, right? Now, when Tolkien finally finishes his work, not long after the Second World War, he sends it to his friend. And C.S. Lewis writes him a letter, and the hair stuck up in the back of my neck when I found this letter. He says to Tolkien, describing the impact of this book on him, he says, I've drained the rich cup and satisfied a long thirst. And then he goes on. So much of your whole life, so much of our joint life, so much of the war, so much that seemed to be slipping away without a trace into the past is now, in a sort, made permanent. It's just an astonishing thing to say. Through the use of his imagination, Tolkien has captured something of their life's journey together, with all of its joys and sorrows, and it's hidden, friends. It's hidden in the pages of his epic story. I think that's what friendship can achieve when it reaches for a high purpose, and it's watered by the streams of sacrifice and loyalty and love. And I think that J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis could create stories of such radiance and nobility when the world around them was so dark and disfigured. That seems itself a mystery of grace to me, because they knew, friends, they knew what it was like to live in the land of shadow. And yet, like Sam Gamgee and Frodo Baggins on the threshold of Mordor, they pressed on. They pressed on through the darkness. They left for us a bright glimpse of the far-off country, friends, and we'll close with this quote. Tolkien now describing it. There, peeping among the cloud rack, high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while, and the beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out on the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end, the shadow was only a small and passing thing, because there was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach. Light and beauty beyond the walls of this world. May each of us find the courage and the grace and the faith to see it. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
We'll take a few minutes for questions, 10, 15 minutes tops. Please, if you would stand, state your name, and offer your question concisely as you can. Go back. They're all in this room. They will be interested in your questions. Please.
Floor is open, right here, yeah. First part of the question. I think that what is happening in the Second World War, of course, Tolkien survives the First World War. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. He survives the First World War. He loses most of his closest friends in that First World War, and that has a profound effect on him. And he writes The Hobbit, which is a series of children's stories. He was telling these stories to his children. It has kind of a whimsical feel, but also there's a seriousness to The Hobbit. But The Lord of the Rings is different. And he says this to his publisher soon after getting into it, maybe a year or so into the work. He says, this is not The Hobbit. This is not a children's story anymore. And he says, the darkness of the current moment has had something to do with it. So the reality, the reality of radical evil, I think, you cannot avoid it, especially if you're living in Great Britain. You're living in Great Britain. So that the way it works itself into his great epic story, to me, is absolutely fascinating, because Sauron is such a demonic figure. And the only thing that separates Great Britain from that demonic figure in Germany is the English Channel and Winston Churchill. Right? So it has to, I think, invade his imagination at some level. And there's more of a realism, you could argue, to The Lord of the Rings, a heaviness to it. The second part of your question there about his support for the Catholics, the fascists in Spain, it's not so much the fascists per se. I know where you're coming from, but he really feels that as a serious believing Catholic, he feels like the Catholics are under assault. The Catholics are under assault in Spain, and what he wants is to see the church protected. I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with that position, but we have to keep in mind the Catholic Church itself had signed an agreement with Hitler in 1933 to protect Catholics in Germany, giving Hitler international respectability. So there's this real desire to protect your own and support the political power that's going to protect your own. I think it helps to explain it. But he was profoundly opposed to the Nazis, as you might know from his letters, because the Nazis want to translate The Hobbit into German. And they're questioning Tolkien about his Jewish blood. Does he have any Jewish blood? And that sets Tolkien off. He says, I won't use his language in the letter. It sets him off. He says, I'll say it, damn the translation. Damn the translation. We're not going to have a translation of The Hobbit in German if that's going to be their perspective. So he's very, very opposed to what that regime represents. But of course, he cares about his Catholic community. I think it helps to explain it. Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Matthew Archer, I wanted to ask a question about you brought up propaganda and how Lewis himself is almost lured into it. What is the difference between art and propaganda in this case, both standing for certain ideals and morals, trying to have a system of thought behind them, and representing the new aesthetics?
Wow. That's a deep, profound question. and I'm out of my depth even trying to answer it, the difference between art and propaganda. Let me just take a stab at it. Yeah. I'll just take a stab at it. When I think of propaganda, I think we commonly understand propaganda. There's no real interest in truth, in presenting truth about the human condition. The objective of propaganda is to deceive, effectively, your audience, to bring them into your camp. It's all about deception. And it seems to me great art, of course, the great art, the great works that they are writing, it's anything but an attempt to deceive people. It's an attempt to what? Awaken people's imagination, their moral imagination. It's like Plato's cave, the parable of the cave. They want to help these ordinary people to come out of the darkness that they're in by giving them these stories of moral beauty, where the darkness is very clearly defined and profoundly unattractive, and goodness and truth and beauty are deeply attractive. The truth of the human condition is what they're trying to reveal to us. And I think that's why their works are still so relevant and still speak to us, because they speak to the human condition in all of its moral complexity. Propaganda doesn't even try to do that, right? Fabulous question. Just took a stab at it. Thanks. Other questions? The floor is open. I got a hand over here and then there. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this amazing talk. My question relates to the previous question. Do you think that Lewis addressed communist ideas later, even in the Broadcast Department, after the war was ended? Do you think that he had any response to some of the nonsense?
I don't know how much after the war years, because I focused my research really up to 1945, but you know, even when he's an atheist, he's writing letters to his father about the communists on the campus at Oxford. And he's basically not cursing them per se, but he's lamenting the fact that there's so many communists willing to do Stalin's bidding in a letter to his dad. So early on, he has a very bad view of the communists. And then in this first autobiography that I mentioned, Pilgrim's Regress, he goes after the communists with an axe. And this is 1933. So I think that one of the most impressive things about Lewis and Tolkien is they are not taken in by these ideologies, guys. You've got to remember, millions of people are paying homage to these totalitarian ideologies. Fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, communism in the Soviet Union, the emperor cult in Japan. Millions paying homage to these dictators. They have bought in. And these guys, Lewis and Tolkien, are completely not taken in. So we have to ask ourselves, why was that? Because they didn't have hindsight, they had insight. How did they get that insight, right? Part of the answer I'm going to say, and I think you guys will appreciate what I'm going to say now here at Baylor, is they were rooted in the classical Christian literary moral tradition, and that gave them perspective. That gave them perspective in a huge way. Thank you for that question. And we had somebody here, and then in the back along the wall over there. We'll get to you, I promise.
Yes, sir. I'm a parent of a student here at Baylor, and it's my hope and prayer that this community produce people that can contribute to this conversation, just like you're saying. I'd love for you to speak to that, and if you could recommend folks that are writers or artists that are contributing to this conversation in the tradition of Lewis and Tolkien, I would appreciate that.
Let me take the first part of the question, make sure I got it now. What would I advise young people who want to contribute in what, any profession, or writing in particular, arts, or what do you mean?
Really in any profession.
Wow. Fabulous question. Let me think about it. You know, let me answer that question. Let me just focus on that question if I could, for time purposes. One of the things that so impresses me about both these men, think about it, they are full-time faculty at Oxford. It's a demanding job. Preparing lectures is a demanding job. Going to faculty meetings is a demanding task. Anybody out there love going to faculty meetings? Just a hand. Yeah, oh, there's one. Okay, great. Yeah. Grading student papers is a demanding task, right? And they're doing war effort work. They're part of the Home Guard, doing nightly patrols. Lewis is out talking to the members of the Royal Air Force during the week. They're doing their bit for king and country. So you got to ask yourself the question, when in the world are they finding time to write their epic stories? When? They're mortgaging time from other things. They're working in the evenings. They're working maybe on the weekends. And what does that tell you? They have to write. They have a sense of calling and a passion and they feel the need. Someone has to speak into the madness. Someone has to write stories that offer hope, that are grounded in the Christian story. And it's going to be them. And they're going to make the time to do it because they have this sense of calling and they have the giftedness, but they're going to do it in community. They're writers in community. So what I would say to young people is find that community of people. Not the wet blanket people who don't really believe in you and are always criticizing you. You have to love them, but you don't have to bring them into the inner circle, the wet blanket people. Bring those people into your life who encourage you and inspire you and challenge you. And so in community. But when you get a sense, young people, when you get a sense of, okay, I think this is what I've got some giftedness, this gets me excited when I think about doing it, the conditions will never be ideal to pursue your calling. The conditions were not ideal during the Second World War. It was a catastrophe, the years they lived through. A human catastrophe from 1939 to 1945. And remember, for the first 2 years or more, it doesn't look like the United States is coming to bail them out. We're on the outs. We're on the other side of the ocean. So that's what I would say. Chase your calling, and the conditions will never be ideal to do so. We had somebody to hand against the wall over there. Yeah, I promise you, yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is C.S. Lewis's and Tolkien's depiction of flaws in their main characters depicts the author's view on maybe England's weaknesses at the time during the war.
Okay, the flaws in their characters, the flaws in their characters reflect the flaws of themselves as writers in community. Was that the question? Of England, okay, the English people. That's a terrific question. You know, Tolkien said, we'll talk about flaws and strengths as well. How about that? Tolkien wrote that his Sam Gamgee was indeed based upon the ordinary English soldier that I knew and fought alongside in the 1914-1918 war. Wow. One of the most adored figures in modern fiction. The Hobbit is based on the English soldier in a trench. But yeah, think about the weaknesses. Let's take those for a second. You know, soft as butter they can be, those hobbits. Kind of just, oh, stay in the hobbit hole in the Shire. It is not an accident that you've got this vision of the Shire thinking that, well, this will just go on and on forever and ever. There's no dangers outside the Shire, right? No need for any kind of vigilance. That theme just runs through the Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? When Gandalf says to Frodo, you can fence the world out, you can fence yourself in, but you cannot forever fence the world out. So I think what Tolkien is identifying in Lewis as well, there was a natural reluctance among the English people to think radical evil could get to them. We're content, we're comfortable, everybody else should believe the way we believe. But that wasn't reality. He's going after that attitude in a huge way, I think. Thank you for that question. Can I close with a quote? Absolutely. Let me close with a quote here, guys. These are wonderful questions. Wish we can go on longer here. One of the things that really encouraged me again about this story is their capacity, the story of these two men, is their capacity to write these stories of moral beauty in a time of incredible ugliness and darkness and despair. I couldn't have done it, living through that time. And think about what Tolkien writes when he describes Rivendell, right? The kingdom of the elves. Here's how he describes it. For a while, the hobbits continued to talk and think of the past journey and of the perils that lay ahead. Remember, they just escaped from the Black Riders, and now they're in Rivendell. But such was the virtue of the land of Rivendell that soon all fear and anxiety was lifted from their minds. The future, good or ill, was not forgotten, but it ceased to have any power over the present. Health and hope grew strong in them, and they were content with each good day as it came, taking pleasure in every meal and in every word and song. That's a dream worth chasing after. That's Rivendell, that's the kingdom. God bless you. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Loving truth, kindling faith, cultivating virtue in friendship, study, and service to Christ and neighbor. That's the vision. That's the motto of the Honors College. This evening has been an expression of that among many other such expressions. We are very grateful, Joe, for your contributions to that effort. Before we part ways, a couple of brief comments. First, students, I want to say something to you. We all recognize there are other events taking place tonight, yet you're here. Only you can say why you chose to be here instead of somewhere else. But here's something to help you think about your choice. A great leader of American higher education, former Yale University President Bart Giamatti, published a collection of essays called A Free and Ordered Space. This is how he describes the well-ordered university: a free and ordered space. Not a free-for-all, not anything goes, not all holds, no holds barred. The freedom rightly enjoyed in universities is, he says, ordered. So 40 years ago, in another time of conflict and ideology and self-interest and slick marketing and populism, Giamatti points to the ordering principles of good universities: love of truth, spirited inquiry, intellectual humility, courage to ask serious questions, the patience to wonder and explore and study and learn. If you're here tonight, I expect these are things you cherish. When the world is riven by conflict and despair, whether of the right or the left, it's not a bad thing for Christians to do what Lewis did, to do what Tolkien did. I'm glad you chose to be here. Next to the last word, Judy Schmeltikoff. You are an amazing, extraordinary friend to Baylor and to the Honors College. We love you dearly. We give thanks for your friendship and your support. Yes. Final word. If you would like a copy of Dr. Loconte's book, you may downstairs, you can get there either through the elevator or through the stairs here to the left. You may purchase a copy. You will not walk out of here tonight with it. You will pre-purchase it. It will be available, though, in a short period of time thereafter, signed by Joe Loconte. The bookstore wanted to have copies available. They didn't show up, but you can pre-order them. They will ship them, and you can have a signed copy come back to you. So if you're interested, I welcome you to do that. If you go downstairs, I want you to know we have some refreshments available, but our friends here at Armstrong Browning Library have a strict limit of 75 people in the Cox Reception Hall. So may I suggest that you get your refreshment downstairs if you so choose, and then exit the door directly that way so that those who come behind you can, as long as the refreshments last, partake of them as well. Grateful for you, delighted to see this place filled. I wish you the best as you, seek to be perhaps hobbit-like or elven, to be like the Bavinzi family, but in any case, to love truth, kindle faith, and cultivate virtue in friendship, study, and service to Christ and neighbor. Good night.